All right, here we go. Welcome back to the Theologizing Subject. Today, I'm really excited. We have Wade Tisthammer on with Maverick Christian. Your channel is really awesome. I think I've watched every video you got out there. So I haven't read your article on the eternal paradox. Um, Most of that's over my head, but I'm just at this point trying to grasp it. So maybe this will be like the layman episode for explain this to me like I'm a 12-year-old or something. It should be fun. Most of my listeners aren't super familiar with analytical philosophy and things like that. Am I too loud?
No, not for me.
Okay. Okay, good. I can't hear myself actually through here, so just want to make sure. So yeah, just to start off here, I was curious what you're up to. I haven't seen anything come out very recently. Are you going to school? I know you mentioned on one of your videos that you were going to school, and figured that maybe that was holding you up, or if you had anything
Yeah,
planned,
grad
or
school's been keeping me busy lately. So
yeah.
my name, introduce myself. My name is Wade Tisthammer. I'm a philosophy graduate student, having previously earned my BA in philosophy from the University of New Orleans. In February 2012, I started a blog titled Maverick Christian. In July 2015, I started Maverick Christian YouTube channel, the first video being on my first live broadcast debate on the moral argument for God's existence. As you mentioned, it's been a little while since I last posted a video. I'm going to work on doing that. But like I mentioned, grad school's been keeping me busy.
I'm sure. Yeah. Well, yeah,
Grad school
first
ain't for
question.
wimps, as it turns out. I've been
Oh.
crossing my fingers. My goal is to graduate, with like a really high GPA,
Mhm.
and let's see how far I could keep that up. My first paper was published my first paper published in philosophy journals on the eternal society paradox, which argues that an eternal society armed with merely the abilities of ordinary humans in each year of existence would have had the ability to create a logical contradiction. So the paradox is actually relatively simple. Um, each year, this society they flip a coin, and if the coin comes up heads, then they all get together and do a particular chant, but only if they did not do a chant in a prior year. Otherwise, they do not do the chant for that year. That's tradition, simply. So one possible outcome to this scenario, which I called scenario S1 in the paper, is that the coin comes up heads for the first time last year. And in that situation, they do the chant remember the tradition is the coin comes up heads, they do the chant, but only if they never did the chant before. The tricky part though comes in. Okay, so that's one possible outcome from this tradition. But if that's possible, then another outcome is also possible. Namely, the coin comes up heads each year because coin flips are probabilistically independent events. So in that situation, did they ever do the chant? Well, they had to have done the chant some year because they would have done it last year if they'd not done the chant before. Because remember, the coin comes up heads. They do the chant then if they never did it before in a prior year. But any year you point to, there's a year prior to that in which they would have done the chant had they not done the chant before. So they had to have done the chant, yet they could not have done the chant. And that produces a logical contradiction. And as the paper mentions, surely there's something metaphysically suspicious about an infinite past and eternal society. The abilities of ordinary humans could create a logical contradiction. By my lights, it's more plausible an infinite past is just never possible in the first place. So that was my first published paper, and it kind of argues against the possibility of an infinite past. I thought that was a cool paradox. I'm proud of that little thing.
Yeah. Have you written anything else on that, or any other papers after that, or has it pretty much just been school?
Mostly school. I'm in the process of trying to get some papers published. Now
Mm.
that paper that I published on the Eternal Society Paradox, even though it was technically published in a philosophy journal, it was kind of cheating because that was an undergraduate philosophy journal. I was an undergraduate philosophy student, publishing in a journal specifically for undergraduate philosophy students.
Oh, okay.
Now, what I'd like to do is compete with the big boys,
Yeah.
but those big boys are like people with like PhDs and stuff. They're like way better philosophers than I am. So trying to publish there has been very difficult, especially if you're trying to get in the most popular journals. That's my goal to get published, and at least one paper in one of those more popular journals. But it's proving to be very difficult.
Yeah. I can't imagine. um. Yeah. So, did you want to go ahead and start off on these questions and
Yeah, sure, let's go.
see where we get?
hmm
So yeah, the first question is, what is the philosophical significance of Star Trek?
There's quite a bit of philosophy that can be talked about in Star Trek. I even have a book in my personal library called Star Trek and Philosophy. But one thing that comes to mind is Derek Parfit's teletransportation thought experiment that's relative to the transporters in Star Trek, though a similar idea predates Parfit's version of it. So imagine you walk into a device that scans your body and cells, destroys it, and sends the information of your body's composition to a replicator device on another planet at the speed of light. Would the replicator then create a where the replicator would create a perfect duplicate of the original scan? Now, would you actually wake up in this new body, or would this teletransport actually kill you and recreate a mere replica? And there are different opinions of that.
Dang. I didn't know if you were going to have a real answer or if you were just going to.
Well, in my
That's
opinion,
awesome.
it would kill you. And here's like one argument that's been advanced in favor of it. Suppose it scans your cell and it creates a replica, but that replica is still there and you're still walking around. Well, obviously that replica can't be you. And so there's the fact that you were destroyed probably wouldn't change matters. You'd still be dead because that replica wouldn't be you
Right.
if for some reason it would just create a replica.
Yeah.
So I think I'm inclined to think that yeah, you'd be dead.
Yeah. I think I'm with you on my pea brain. Well, yeah, man. That was just the fun one. So let's go ahead and get into the good stuff. So yeah, for just regular believers out there who maybe don't even know what analytical philosophy is. What is that, and why is it important for believers, or is it important for the everyday believer?
Well, very roughly, analytical philosophy or analytic philosophy is a sort of philosophical movement from the turn of the 20th century that nowadays is characterized by a type of method or approach for doing philosophy that emphasizes clarity, rigor, precision, and, of course, analysis. This type of approach is helpful for doing apologetics. To use one example, consider one objection to the Trinity I saw online that goes roughly like this: the Father is God, the Son is God, the Holy Spirit is God. All these entities are identical to God, where identity just means being the same thing as. So water is identical to H2O. But this Trinitarian doctrine produces an absurdity, since if the Father is God and Jesus is God, then the Father is the same entity as the Son, which is false on Christian orthodoxy. Now, our response to this is to distinguish the is of predication from the is of identity. Now, the is of identity would be like saying water is H2O. I'm intending to communicate that water and H2O are the same thing. An example of the is of predication is, say, if I say the couch is green, I'm not saying the couch is the same thing as the color green. I'm describing a quality of the couch, namely its color. Similarly, when a Christian theologian says Jesus is God, they're not using the is of identity, but rather the is of predication to express Jesus' identity. Now, that tool of analysis of like breaking things apart and having more rigor, clarity, and precision for exactly what sort of is we're using here, that's part of philosophy, and that can be useful in responding to objections like what about the Trinity? Isn't the Trinity incoherent? And usually those things are pretty easily dispelled, a lot of times anyway.
Hmm. Yeah. Do you think like with the Trinity example, do you think so your argument would be that it is logically coherent?
Yeah, I think it's logically coherent, but you just have to be careful on how you describe it because people can
Yeah.
easily misunderstand things. And where that kind of approach of doing philosophy, where you're having this kind of analytical mindset, and these concepts like the is of predication, the is of identity, can be helpful in clarifying what the Trinity is, as well as in the process responding to objections like that.
Awesome. Awesome. I like it. Um. Yeah. The next question, unless you had any more on that,
Oh no, I'm good.
how should a Christian respond if they hear a philosophical argument that appears to contradict Scripture? What would be maybe your advice to them, or how would you deal with that as a philosopher?
Well, I have a philosophy degree, so it's easier for me to deal with it because I just like think about
Yeah.
it and research it. But for the non-philosopher, one thing to look at it is how Christian philosophers have responded to the philosophical argument. And I'm not saying you need a philosophy degree to do philosophy, but people knowledgeable of philosophy are all else held constant going to be in a better position to respond to philosophical arguments. And for a Christian who wants to know more about philosophy, I recommend William Lane Craig and J.P. Moreland's book, Philosophical Foundations for a Christian Worldview. That's a pretty good introductory book. It's a little challenging, but it's also kind of built for kind of like the intelligent freshman or sophomore college student.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's good. I People tend to sometimes just freak out and run off if they can't find an answer, when I think there's not really a need for that. I think just being patient and digging in can usually get you the information that you need. But yeah, um, on that, has there been any in your lifetime? Because I don't really know a lot about your formation or how you became saved, or was there anything between then and now that had challenged you that kind of made you think, oh, maybe this isn't true, or
Yeah, when I was in high school, I had some of my some doubts. It's like, is Christianity true? Does God exist? And so I looked into that. And during this time period, I had sort of an interest in computer programming and physics. And I noticed one thing that kind of helped me bring around, I think that God probably exists, is a kind of a teleological argument. It's the applicability of mathematics. That particular vlog episode, I go into more detail. But I thought about how if you take a hard drive, for example, and randomize it, have the ones and zeros assigned randomly, what's the most likely result you're going to get from that? Well, it'll be like the one zeros would be set sporadically with no meaningful pattern. And yet, if I say this hard drive has been randomized, or maybe it was a product of design, and you find instead of the ones and zeros assigned sporadically, you find that there is actually a software on it with algorithms directing behavior in an orderly, predictable fashion, you'd see, well, that's more likely to be the product of design because of all the ways it conceivably could have been like, this is relatively unlikely in the absence of a designer. And I thought, it's the same thing with the universe too. When you look at the equations of physics, it's basically an algorithmic structure for the universe. We could see the universe being radically different, like chaotic, jumbled mess, disorderly, unpredictable behavior. But we don't have that. We have these very nice, neat mathematical algorithms directing behavior, making physics almost ludicrously successful in accurately and precisely predicting behavior. So Einstein mentioned this. Eugene Wigner kind of mentioned something along these lines, the reasonable effectiveness of mathematics. Einstein called it, it's a miracle that we have this type of order that we see in this universe. And of course, for the theist, the answer is easy. The reason why we have this remarkable software-like order, as opposed to a randomized hard drive universe, is that it's a product of design. And so that made me think that, yeah, God probably exists. And of course, later on, I went to apologetics to find further evidence for theism, so that sometimes when I do debate with atheists, I like to do that just to see their point of view, because Christianity is one thing. I can understand how someone would not be Christian. Yeah, this religious leader came back from the dead. Okay, I get that. Atheism, I have a little bit more trouble with, all things considered, once all the evidence is considered, because once all the evidence is considered, it seems like the evidence seems pretty strongly against atheism, in my opinion. And that little bit of sample, that's one reason why I think atheism is probably false, is that particular teleological argument.
yeah. You think you're going to be debating any atheists anytime soon, or?
I don't know, anytime soon. Last time was like a few months ago, and that was just basically a discussion. I'd be open to it. I don't know if you're eager. Don't know of any if you know any atheists for me to stop with, but yeah, I'd be okay with it.
If I do, I'll send them your way. Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, the next question: how do we know anything at all? What kind of certainty can a person have about God's existence and the gospel? And I know those two questions are probably similar, but not the same.
Yeah, so how do we know anything at all is redolent to the problem of the criterion, which involves these two questions. A, what do we know? And B, how do we know what we know? That is, what criterion do we use for knowledge? So one could think, to answer the first question of what we know, we need a criterion for knowledge. But to have a criterion for knowledge, we need to have an answer for what that first question is, which is, what do we know? After all, we need to know the criterion for how we know what we know. So one... one proposed solution to this mess is particularism, where we start knowing specific facts without using criterion. So a lot of things that we accept non-inferentially. That is, we accept not on the basis of some type of inference. So, for example, one might think that one believes in their own existence on non-inferential grounds. It just seems obvious to them. Or they might naturally immediately believe that their memories and sense experiences are at least sometimes reliable. So I think we just start with certain particular aspects of knowledge, and we're at least rationally justified in accepting those things in the absence of any reason to believe the contrary. Now, as for the gospel, Alvin Plantinga argued that if Christianity is true, certain Christian beliefs are properly basic, or a basic belief is where you believe it on non-inferential grounds, and a properly basic belief is when you're justified in having that basic belief. So Plantinga describes the sensus divinitatis as like a sense of divinity, which in a wide variety of circumstances produces in us beliefs about God. And Plantinga's model for how we might believe in Christianity without evidence or arguments includes the inner witness of the Holy Spirit, or the instigation of the Holy Spirit to deliver proper justification. The Holy Spirit becomes a source of belief, a cognitive process that produces in us beliefs in the main lines of the Christian story. Now, I'm not saying one couldn't believe in God and Christianity on the basis of arguments or evidence. I think there is very strong evidence for God's existence myself, and at least decent evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. For God's existence, for example, I believe that the moral argument provides very strong grounds for thinking God probably exists. But even so, I think it's also important to keep in mind that many of us aren't really into apologetics and aren't terribly familiar with such arguments and evidence. But if Christianity is true, I think, as Plantinga said, something like what the model he had is true, where the Holy Spirit plays some role in giving us properly justified true beliefs about the Gospels.
Yeah. So tell me how bad because I don't know anything. It's Kierkegaard. He talks about a leap of faith. Does that have to do with this aspect of following the evidence as far as you can, but then you have to kind of just take a leap of faith?
Not quite, because this is more of like proper justification being the product of the Holy Spirit. So,
Yeah.
I mean, it's faith in that it's not inferential basis from other beliefs, but I'm not sure that's what Kierkegaard had in mind.
Okay.
He probably didn't have in mind that type of model of proper justification that Plantinga has, at least not as I recall.
Okay. Yeah, I've heard William Lane Craig. He does make that what you're describing here is just the knowing, given by the Holy Spirit. And he doesn't. He says he doesn't discount his experience, but he does, like you are saying, there is very strong evidence and arguments to the positive, like. But then he will always end up saying, yeah, but in the end, it's like I know that I'm saved because of the Holy Spirit, something along those lines. He says it way better than that, obviously, but anyway, yeah. Well, that's cool. So back to how do we know anything at all? You mentioned starting with individual like facts, bits of evidence. Is that obviously you're not saying out of context of the other evidence, right? So it's not like you're just taking one thing here without any context. So I'm just trying to wrap my head around that. I don't know if that makes sense.
Well, yeah, we start with things with properly basic fundamental things, but then we can build from there.
Mhm.
So as far as how we can believe things, it helps to know the tools of logic and critical thinking. Logic is a branch of philosophy concerned with good and correct reasoning, and it boggles my mind that logic isn't part of standard K through 12 education. One of the things I want to do after I get my master's is write a book at kind of the K through 12 level about logic and critical thinking.
Yeah.
Now, granted, some stuff in logic is very complicated, but some of it is quite easy and would be quite amenable for teaching at the K through 12 level. If you can learn algebra, you can learn some basic and propositional logic. I kind of have a crash course on propositional logic on my Maverick Christian blog. As for the elements of critical thinking, one important thing to remember is beware emotional attachments to beliefs, like in religion and politics. In psychology, there's something called motivated reasoning, which is unconsciously processing information in a way to suit some end or goal, like believing what you want to be true. There's confirmation bias, a tendency to fit new evidence in a way that conforms to one's views. For example, searching only for evidence that what favors one's views, making an effort to avoid contrary evidence, and having a biased interpretation of evidence to favor one's views. There's also something called disconfirmation bias, which is a tendency for greater critical scrutiny of views that go against one's own, like the exerting disproportionately greater effort to disconform views that one believes. So I recommend being aware of those biases and actively fighting against them. If, for instance, you come across a claim that favors a view you really like, that's when you have to be especially careful and vigilant because of those biases. For example, if you learn informal fallacies like straw men and red herrings, be vigilant about you yourself and people on your own side having an issue employing those fallacies. One thing that might help, particularly when it comes to like things that you like, both in religion and politics, is try to keep in mind that just because the view is correct doesn't mean the evidence is completely one-sided in favor of it. So that's why I'm willing to say, okay, I think this argument works, but I'm not convinced that this such and such argument is a particularly good one. Like some version of the ontological arguments. Like, I don't think it's a particularly good argument, and I don't have to worry about like becoming too emotionally attached to it because I just remember that principle. Just because my view is correct doesn't mean the evidence is completely one-sided for it. Doesn't mean that every argument in favor of it is going to work and so forth. So I think keeping those things in mind will help.
So does that get into like? Because I've heard you talk about like a logic argument can be logically sound. Is that right? But it can still be wrong.
Well, it can be the ontological argument can be like sound, but also not a very good argument.
Okay,
So
just
how
weak.
could that work? So here's an example of a sound argument that is also a really bad argument. Either God exists or 2 plus 2 equals 5. It is not the case that 2 plus 2 equals 5. Therefore, God exists. Now, this is a logically valid argument. The conclusion follows from the premises, and the premises are true, at least if God exists. But it's also a really lousy argument because the only reason somebody could believe that, those premises are if you already believe in God. And the ontological argument is kind of like that. Because of the way God is defined, someone who exists in all possible worlds or none of them, basically, uh, believing that God possibly exists is basically tantamount to believing that God exists. And believing God possibly doesn't exist is tantamount to believing that he doesn't exist. Because God is defined to be metaphysically necessary entity. So it's really not a good argument, at least not in isolation.
Okay. And you'd say you're an evidentialist, right? Are you comfortable with that
I wouldn't say I'm
category
an
or?
evidentialist. I mean, it also kind of depends on how you define evidentialism. I actually have a blog article that says evidentialism sucks, or why evidentialism sucks. So, if our conception of evidence is something that makes a belief more likely to be true, and okay, do we need evidence in order to believe something is true? And the answer is no, we actually don't. In fact, it can't work that way. And here's an example of how that can be the case. Imagine this following brain into vat experiment, thought experiment. Now consider the hypothesis your brain in a vat that's feeding you all the experiences, all the memories, the perceptions, the sense experiences you now have. And suppose this hypothesis says you were created just a few years ago. And now you can't actually have any evidence against this hypothesis, at least not when you're using like empirical data. Well, I remember this. No, your memories can be created for it. And the reason why is because this hypothesis perfectly predicts all the data that you could appeal to. And if that's the case, you can't really use that data as evidence against this hypothesis. So, and yet you can believe that, for example, that you have hands, that you are not a handless brain in a vat. You're properly justified in believing that. Even if you can't really have any evidence against the hypothesis, you could still be justified in believing that this hypothesis is false. And so, arguably, you could say that, well, maybe God or maybe certain Christian truths are like that, in which we can be rational and justified in believing those truths, even if we don't have evidence for them in that particular evidential sense. Now, an evidentialist could get around this by defining evidence differently from what I had. But if your conception of evidence is something that evidence is something that makes a belief more likely to be true, then I'm not an evidentialist in that sense. From that, because of that,
Okay.
brain in the vat thought experiment.
So would you how would you categorize like where you're at with like epistemology?
Well, I accept some form of particularism, like I mentioned before, that we kind of start with knowing basic things, and we kind of can build from there.
Okay. Yeah. Man, who was it? Who was it? Claims aren't evidence. You dealt
Oh,
a
that was
lot with
Matt
him.
Dillahunty, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Man, you need to debate him.
I'd be open to it. I don't know if
That'd be
he's
fun.
interested in debating me, but yeah,
I
I
don't
kind of
know
want to
if
get
you
like
would.
maybe a few papers published before I do that, because there's this one paper. Like, I'm curious, for example, how I know how he would respond to the moral argument. I did a video about him, how basically how Dilthey lost the argument before it began because he doesn't
Yeah.
believe in morality in the ordinary sense of the term. So like it's like I almost win the debate that way. It's like, well, he doesn't believe anything is morally wrong in the ordinary sense of the term, not even torturing if it's just for fun. That's the price he's willing to pay to be an atheist. And that's why that's one reason why I'm not an atheist. I don't think it's reasonable to believe that there's anything wrong with torturing if it's just for fun. There's also a psychophysical harmony argument that Apologetics Squared and other people have talked about. Capturing Christianity had a philosopher talk about. I'm blanking on his name, but he had a really good philosophically sophisticated guest on to explain that. I'm curious how he'd respond to that because that's one thing. Is like if I were an atheist, I'm like, I don't know how to get around this one, the psychophysical harmony argument.
Can you go a little detail on that? What is that about?
Oh yeah, so basically we have these maps between our brain states and our mental experiences. They fit together in a harmonious way. So to oversimplify it a bit, we have our brain states. They produce like mental experiences, and they produce behavior, those electrochemical reactions. Now, we can conceive of a world in which those mental experiences are like wildly divorced from what our behavior is. So imagine a world that has the exact same electrochemical reactions that we have of our brains, but those mental experiences produced by our bodies are just like divorced. Like instead of like me seeing you here right now, they'd be like I'd be experiencing like warm bath water sensation or like akin to like 1980s TV static. And we could just like replace all the experiences with like some variety of static. And we could go about the world that way. Theoretically, the world could have been designed that way. But instead, our mental experiences and our brain states, they're kind of linked in a very orderly way.
Okay.
And so out of the numerous conceivable ways that psychophysical pairing between mental experiences and brain states, out of the numerous conceivable ways that could happen, ours happens to be way in a kind of way that quote unquote makes sense.
Okay.
And so, well, that's pretty coincidental, isn't it? And so they can use like, well, design is a good explanation for that sort of thing. So I'm oversimplifying it by a lot, but that's the general idea.
Yeah. No, I need to look into that one.
So yeah, Apologetics Squared has a pretty good simple explanation for it. He's a
Awesome.
pretty good YouTube. That's a pretty good YouTube channel.
Yeah, I have to check that out. I don't think I've heard of that one. But, yeah, as far as philosophy, I haven't listened to much other. I mean, William Lane Craig was, started off with him, but I'm still working on it, grinding stuff out. So you debated an atheist. I don't remember his name, but it was like a 3-hour conversation. And I just wanted to commend you for it because you're extremely patient with this guy. Because to me, it seems like after watching that, I'm just like, okay, it seems like Christians give, okay, here's my evidence, here's my arguments. And it seems like usually all atheists have is, yeah, but what if it was this way? You know? What if it was not what we see in reality, but what if it was some other way? You know what I mean? I mean, does that make any sense?
Maybe if you could give a specific example to illustrate what you're saying, I get a better idea.
I don't know if I could. That's okay. Um anyway, it just seems like they always go to the abstract, and I'm not smart enough to really grasp it, but yeah, that's okay. We can move on from that. um yeah, so we did how do we know anything at all? So the next question, you kind of already hit on it, but how can we know if we're believing something untrue?
Yeah, like you said, I kind of hit on it. You basically kind of use logic and critical thinking, being aware of those biases I mentioned before, be aware of emotional attachments of belief. Um, Remembering that just because a belief is correct doesn't mean that the evidence is completely one-sided in favor of it. Doesn't mean that every argument in favor of it is a good one. And if you keep like those critical thinking principles in mind, you're less likely to be wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, I can see how the learning like logic and stuff like that can be really helpful. Can you learn logic if you are terrible at math? Is that
Um,
possible?
it's it's pretty. I mean, if you can like learn some simple algebraic rules, it's not too hard. The basic propositional logic isn't very hard.
Mhm. So yeah,
Yeah,
if
if
you
you
get that
can.
groundwork, then you can
Yeah,
survive.
I mean, learning logic certainly helped me to think more logically. It's like, oh, here's some errors in my thinking, and then I lean these basic rules of logic. Okay, that helps me understand what a logically valid argument is. And like I mentioned before, it boggles my mind that it's not part of standard K through 12 education.
Yeah.
Logic really should
Yeah.
be, in my opinion. My just for personal experiences, my work in apologetics would be so much easier if everybody learned logic.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because some atheists, not all, some atheists are just, like smart, logical people, but some atheists like it's like they give lip service to logic, but not even taking little least bit of effort to actually learn what logic and reason are really like. Like for example, one version of the moral argument goes something like, "If God does not exist, then objective morality does not exist. Objective morality does exist. Therefore, God exists." Now, anybody sufficiently familiar with like freshman level logic would see that the conclusion follows from the premises. Some people think, "Oh, that argument is invalid. The conclusion doesn't follow from the premises," which it very obviously does. To anybody sufficiently familiar with logic, like, ugh. Or they make, or they don't seem to realize like what a logically valid argument is. It's like they say, "Well, you have arguments. I want evidence." Well, in a logically valid argument, the truth of the premises is evidence for the conclusion. In fact, the premises, if true, guarantee the conclusion. So it's like I'm offering you evidence. Don't just say, "I don't want arguments. I want evidence." I'm offering you the evidence. Go ahead, address the
Yeah.
evidence.
So
And
would
one
someone like
very
Matt
popular
Dillahunty, would he disagree with what you're saying? I mean, would he, or how would he, deal with
oh,
that?
I'm not. I don't know. I haven't debated him.
That's okay. Yeah, yeah. Um,
Um, Maybe he maybe he would. I mean, even if he's not a philosopher, maybe he could understand, like, okay, that for a valid argument to be sound, there would need to be a false premise. And a very popular tactic I've seen for atheists, for some atheists anyway, is when I respond to, like, okay, so this argument seems sound to me, which premise is false? And they dodge the question. Or they make an objection, does nothing to attack the truth or justification of any premise of the argument. But of course, by ignoring the premises, that's tantamount to ignoring the evidence. It's like, there is no evidence for God. Here's an argument. And they make an objection that doesn't address the evidence. Like, but you're just ignoring the evidence. That's not a good way to do philosophy, generally speaking.
Yeah, yeah. In several of your conversations, I've heard you just consistently say, "Yeah, but that doesn't do anything to my premise." It's like they're always just trying to go
Yeah,
around the premise.
it's
So
annoyingly common.
yeah, yeah. Is that similar to the Kalam cosmological argument, like the taxi cab fallacy, where they essentially you get to the end of the argument, everything that begins to exist has a cause, but they just say except God, like that. They're trying to get. Hey, have you heard? I mean, I don't know if I've heard that from an actual person, but I've in William Lane Craig's On
Uh,
Guard. That's kind of how
not
he
ex
portrayed
well,
it.
I think it's something different. It's kind of like the
Okay.
approach to the first premise, the inconsistency, where they kind of accept in practice this general principle of whatever begins to exist without a cause. For example, suppose an officer pulls me over and they find like a suspiciously large amount of money in my trunk. I say, okay, how did that get in there? Well, I say, golly gee willikers, officer, that money just popped into being uncaused out of nothing. And the officer probably wouldn't believe me. Nobody would believe me. We accept that general principle of that just thing doesn't happen. Or if we found like robots on Pluto, I say, oh, this was probably the product of design because we found these robots. Or it's like, what if these robots popped into being uncaused out of nothing? Maybe that happens. Like, we don't take that possibility seriously. So if
Yeah.
we accept that general principle, but exempt it when we get to the universe, like, oh, maybe the universe popped into being uncaused out of nothing. It's like, it seems like you're being a little bit of special pleading here. I mean, even if I were an atheist, I would not accept that explanation. I would accept, you know, even if I wouldn't believe in God, I wouldn't accept that because that's just too ridiculous. It's too much special pleading.
Yeah, maybe that's the what if I was trying to articulate earlier. Just yeah, but what if it came from nothing? When you have a solid argument as to we obviously know nothing comes from nothing, right? But I don't know. Anyway, um, so yeah, we can jump into the next question. I've been trying my best to learn a lot about presuppositional apologetics, which is newer to me. So I was curious just what your opinion was on that. If you have dealt with that much or read about that, like Van Til, Bonson, Rushdoony, people like that. I don't know if you're familiar with any of them, but
Presuppositional apologetics, at least my understanding of it, says that you need to believe in God to have certain justified beliefs, like various scientific beliefs. Those sorts of claims do not strike me as plausible. I do think, however, God is ultimately responsible for our knowledge, even if you don't need to believe in God to have knowledge. For example, even atheists can intuit reasonableness of the moral principle of loving your neighbor as yourself. You don't need to believe in God to know that that principle is morally valid. Same thing true with other principles. I don't think you need to believe in God to have knowledge, though I think in the absence of God, certain knowledge claims are going to have problems.
okay. What do you think about? So I've heard Greg Bonson say things like all facts are interpreted, as in
Um,
you can look at the same fact and come to a different conclusion. And I wondered if that was what you're getting at when you talk about intuition.
Not exactly. No, I was thinking more like having properly basic beliefs, but there is
Okay.
some sense in which like facts are interpreted. Like, so I'm an evolutionist, but one of the things I've noticed about the creation evolution debate is that a creationist evolutionist can look at the same set of data and have wildly different views about where that evidence points, whether the data points in favor of evolution or creationism. And so there is something to that. In fact, in
Mhm.
philosophy of science, I just said that empirical data underdetermines theories. It is for any set of data, there's basically countless logically possible theories that are consistent with that data. And so there is a matter of interpretation. It's like, okay, so which theory do you choose? And that's where things like simplicity, explanatory power, explanatory scope, and stuff like that comes into effect to try to figure out the best theory that fits the data.
Okay.
So there is
So
some truth to that. Facts are interpreted.
okay, yeah. So you're saying intuition has really nothing to do with
Well,
it.
I guess
It
I could
boils
say
down to the
intuition.
evidence, and I choose this side, you choose that side.
Well, intuition does kind of play into role, I suppose. When you're doing, like, for example, suppose like you're in a jury and you're evaluating the evidence, like for it, you kind of like you just kind of intuitively perceive that the evidence favors the guilt of somebody. You don't have like a rigorous mathematical algorithmic procedure to get you that conclusion.
Mhm.
You just kind of okay, fingerprints are on the gun. Uh, Fingerprints on the gun. The accused fingerprints were on the gun. He has the motive. He's got the opportunity, for example, that you calculate that he's probably guilty, not through some rigorous mathematical procedure. It just seems intuitive to you that that's where the evidence points. And if you ask a layperson, well, what if some unknown force we've never experienced before caused all that evidence to happen? The layperson would say, that seems unlikely to me, even if they can't really elucidate why. So, to some degree, intuition is still involved in that sort of situation.
So maybe would you relate like intuition to salvation? Because in the presuppositional like sphere, they seem to like I believe in order to understand. You know what Augustine said. So do you see any like relation with those intuitions to salvation or not? Like someone that's saved and someone that's not saved. Does that make any sense?
Well, first, maybe should clarify what intuition is. Intuition, in the philosophical sense of the term, is what the consciousness immediately apprehends and what is readily present to one's consciousness. So, for example, an example would be like when mentally sees that 1 + 1 = 2, or intuits that sense experience memory are at least sometimes reliable. Is intuition responsible for salvation? Well, like the doctrine of salvation, like who gets saved and who doesn't. That's like, yeah, I don't know how that works. As far as uh, properly justified Christian belief, I think intuition can play some role. Like I mentioned earlier, with like the inner witness of the Holy Spirit, that sort of thing, that can properly justify Christian beliefs. Then Christians can kind of intuitively accept they have this intellectual, seeming to be true experience that could play a role in properly justifying their beliefs in the gospel.
Okay. So yeah, it seems like on the evidential, and I'm not sure about particularism, but on the evidential side of things, it seems like I've heard a lot of times like these two methodologies can supplement each other. But it seems like on
Yeah,
the
in a way, they could have
presuppositional
like
side, they argue with that a lot. They say no, it has to be this way. A lot of times, it seems more like it has to be this way. It's evidentialism is falls too short, and maybe that's even kind of what you were saying earlier. But I don't know what you think about. Do you think they're compatible at all? Do you think they can be useful to each other, or is it one or the other? Or
they're in some respects they're complementary in that you can have like a properly basic belief, and you can also have you get a properly basic belief in Christianity. You can also have supplement that kind of warrant with further arguments in favor of it, like
Mhm.
like various apologetics arguments. So in that sense, I suppose they're compatible.
Okay, would you agree in general, like that not having a belief in the existence of God uh reduces your reasoning to absurdity? That makes sense. I've heard quotes
Um,
like that.
Not inherently. I mean, I think you have like certain precarious grounds, like if you want to believe like the moral knowledge exists and you also don't believe in God. That's like precarious grounds. You can still have more knowledge without believing in God.
Okay.
But it's kind of like there's a little bit of a coherency problem because it seems to me that given God's non-existence, it's very unlikely that we would have moral knowledge. And so there's certain little epistemological problems like that there, but you can still have moral knowledge even if you don't believe in God, for
Okay.
example.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, the presuppositional framework doesn't seem to be as widespread. So I'm always curious as I'm trying to learn about it, asking how other people see that or look at that. A lot of people just haven't looked too deep into it. But then yeah, other people I feel like have good reasons for maybe rejecting it, or at least not thinking it's the only valid approach or whatever. Um. So yeah, any other thoughts on that? Before we move
Nope,
on
I
to
guess
the
not.
to your favorite argument, the moral argument. Did you maybe just want to? Because yeah, a lot of my audience, my giant audience, they maybe aren't familiar with these types of logical arguments. Yeah, if you just wanted to kind of break down the moral argument for us, that'd be cool. I know you're a fan of this one, so
Yeah, so the moral argument is a family of arguments for that use morality as a reason to believe in God. So on my Maverick Christian blog, I have an article called "The Moral Argument: A Quick Version," but I can summarize some points here. First, I should define what I mean by morality, because I found out the hard way that sometimes theists and atheists talk past each other in moral argument because they're using the same terms differently. So, roughly what I find by morality, I'll explain the sort of ought used in moral obligation. So, some oughts are purely descriptive, like when if you want to do well in school, you ought to study, just means something like, as a matter of practical necessity, you need to study to do well in school. So some oughts, however, prescribe in a way that is not purely descriptive, like someone saying you shouldn't torture infants just for fun. They might be using this type of ought. And this type of ought I'm using in my definition of morality, that is a type of ought that does not have only descriptive qualities. Now, that may seem too obvious to mention, but as I mentioned before, I found out that some atheists redefine morality so that the moral ought is reducible to the purely descriptive, because the ordinary sense of the moral ought, as an action is morally wrong for someone, or if they ought not to do it, is very problematic on atheism. One reason why is that this ordinary moral semantics implies that a property like moral wrongness is non-natural. That is, it's not entirely part of the natural physical world. Also, barring the supernatural, at least, moral wrongness is causally inert and empirically undetectable. To illustrate, imagine a moral nihilist, that is, someone who does not believe in moral wrongness, and a moral realist who does believe in moral wrongness. Observe some jerk kicking a dog just for fun. The dog whimpers in pain and runs away. Now, both agree on all the same physiological and psychological facts, such as the dog felt pain and suffered minor injury. The moral nihilist says, well, I don't think moral wrongness is associated with that action. The moral realist says, I think moral wrongness is attached to that action. There is no empirical way to determine who is right here. Both views agree to all the same empirically observable facts. In this sense, moral wrongness is empirically undetectable. Moral wrongness being non-natural is largely why it is invisible and empirically undetectable in that scenario. But then, how do we have moral knowledge? Well, the theist could say that God designed our cognitive faculties as via superintended evolution in such a way that when they're functioning properly, we intuit certain moral truths, just as we intuit elementary truths of mathematics and logic. Like 1 + 1 = 2, for example, we kind of just see that. Now, for atheism, moral intuition delivering knowledge is very problematic. Moral wrongness is not natural, and since anything outside the natural causally affecting the world would be supernatural, then barring the supernatural, moral properties like moral wrongness are causally inert, and they would have no causal influence over whether our brains would produce moral intuitions. And so we'd have the same intuitions of moral wrongness existing, regardless of whether moral wrongness existed. And this would seem to undercut such intuition from properly justifying our belief in morality. Whereas in theism, and in particular Christianity, where where in Romans, for example, it says God wrote the law in our hearts. Theist has kind of an explanation for it, whereas atheism, it seems we wouldn't have more knowledge. So here's one version of the argument for moral knowledge. Premise 1, if God does not exist, then we do not have moral knowledge. Premise 2, we do have moral knowledge. For example, we know that it's morally wrong to torture infants just for fun. Conclusion, God exists. A version of the moral argument could use the existence of morality, for example, going something along the lines of, if God does not exist, then objective morality does not exist. Objective morality does exist, premise 2. Conclusion, therefore, God exists, whereby moral objectivism means that the moral truths are hold independently of human belief and perception of them. Quick way to justify that second premise, that moral objectivism is true, is just point to a specific example the non-theist might agree to. Like a homophobic bigot torturing a lesbian just because of her sexual orientation. The homophobe killing or brainwashing everyone who thought otherwise so that everyone agrees such violent homophobic bigotry is morally right. When clearly such violent homophobia would still be morally wrong. So, if you come across someone's like, I don't believe in objective morality. Okay, what about this example? This violent homophobe, would this bigot still be doing something wrong? And, maybe they'd bite the bullet, but they'd have to bite pretty darn hard to say, well, I, as a Christian, believe that homophobia is morally wrong, and you disagree? Be interesting enough, if nothing else. Okay, so what about that?
It's rare for people to admit that, right?
Yeah.
To be consistent.
The point is try to find common ground, so something they're less likely to disagree with. And most people, most non-theists, I would imagine, are more likely to agree that this violent homophobia is morally wrong in that scenario. Now, what about that first premise, that objective morality does not exist if God does not exist? Well, there are a number of ways to justify it, but my approach is to use a theorem of mathematics and propositional logic that says, given A, probably C entails probably if A, then C. So, for example, given God's non-existence, it is likely that objective morality does not exist, entails probably if God does not exist, then objective morality does not exist. All we have to do then is to assume for sake of argument that atheism is true, and for atheists, that step will be easy. Then evaluate whether it's likely that objective morality does not exist. So how might that work? Well, in theism, It makes perfect sense there'd be some component of reality transcending our opinion that says we shouldn't do certain things. But in atheism, moral wrongness is very strange. It's invisible, non-physical, and empirically undetectable. So why shouldn't the consistent atheist reject the existence of this invisible, non-physical thing that cannot be empirically detected? If the atheist is to reject the existence of invisible, non-physical deities that have allegedly not been empirically detected. Given atheism, it seems more likely that people's belief in moral wrongness is a delusion brought about by evolution to get us to behave in certain ways and help our species survive. Given atheism, moral wrongness probably doesn't exist. Now, at this point, the atheist could bite the bullet and say, I believe people's intuition of moral wrongness is a delusion brought about by sociobiological evolution. Then one has to ask themselves, which is more plausible, that there's something morally wrong with torturing an infant just for fun, or atheism? Some atheists would sooner believe that there's nothing wrong with torturing an infant just for fun than abandon atheists, but highlights that level of irrationality is akin to religious fanaticism. And this is one reason why I think that this moral argument, as well as the argument for moral knowledge, is pretty strong. I don't see a particularly good way to go around it. Another version of the moral argument tries to use God as an ontological explanation of morality. That is, an explanation for how it is that morality exists, a foundation for objective morality. Now, as many people already know, one conception of God is that he's a non-natural component of reality that has these supremely authoritative obligations for us, and we all to obey his dictates. But here's the interesting thing. What is objective morality? Well, it's a non-natural component of reality that has these supremely authoritative obligations for us, and we all ought to obey his dictates. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Sounds suspicious like God. Now, on atheism, something like objective morality would be extremely surprising, but on theism, objective morality is not at all surprising. It's very expected, and God provides a very straightforward ontological explanation for objective morality. So this is yet another way morality could be used for evidence for God. So one was the argument for moral knowledge. If God exists, we don't have moral knowledge. Premise two is that the second moral argument I explained was the existence of morality. Given atheism, it's likely that objective morality doesn't exist. And that third part of the moral argument was God provides a very straightforward ontological explanation for morality. So that second argument says if God doesn't exist, objective morality does not exist. It doesn't specify the connection, the metaphysical connection between the two, just the epistemic one, at least my version of it. The third one, I think, ties everything together. Okay, that relation, probably, if God exists and objective morality exists, well, God is probably the foundation of morality. Now, lots more can be said about the moral argument, but I think this suffices to get some general idea behind it. I think it's very strong evidence for theism. If I had to pick one argument for theism to be an atheist with, it'd be this one, because I don't see a good way around it for the atheist.
I think this is William Lane Craig's favorite, or at least he said it's the most effective when he's.
Well, I don't think it's his favorite, but I think he admits this is his most effective one. Even though I think that the way he argues for the first premise isn't really the best, in my opinion, because he kind of argues from that foundational aspect. Whereas the way I argue for that first premise is to say, okay, forget how morality is grounded for that moment. Just say, is it likely on atheism that objective morality exists? And for a lot of atheists to say, okay, suppose for sake of argument God exists, again, for atheists that'll be easy, is it likely that objective morality exists? A lot of atheists say, no, I don't think it's likely that objective morality exists. Well, then we have that support for the first premise.
Okay. So given all of that, how, maybe have grace with me here. Would people go from there to what would you say to people that they will just look at the world globally and say, well, yeah, but maybe kicking a dog here is a pastime that people think is totally fine, and maybe here it's not, And I know that can only go so far because
well, yeah, well, you can if necessary, you could pick a different example like that homophobic one, and they're probably more likely to agree with that. Or it's like, what about the Crusades, about the Inquisition? But violent homophobia, maybe there's some people who say it's like, oh yeah, that violent homophobia doing nothing wrong with torturing a lesbian for a sexual orientation. Most people probably wouldn't buy that.
Yeah, you can always just go to, oh wait, so everyone everywhere should say Hitler was wrong, right? Because if you tell me that he wasn't, or that it's part of the conversation, or that somewhere that's okay, then obviously no one's going to believe you. Right?
One thing to watch out for is red herrings too. So like you say, well, some people thought dog kicking was okay. It's like, yeah, okay, maybe, but so what? That does nothing to attack any premise of the argument.
Okay. Yeah.
Maybe some people think violent homophobia is okay. Maybe things like throwing gay people off of roofs is more than okay. Well, does that mean that homophobia is right? Well no. There's still objective truth about violent homophobia being morally wrong.
Yeah.
Or I could use another example like slavery. What about anti-black slavery? It's like, enslaving black people. Wasn't that morally wrong back then, even when society thought it was right? I think it was wrong. Don't you think it was wrong?
Yeah. No, I think it's very powerful. I've used that a lot
Yeah,
to the
I think
extent that I
like
can understand it.
yeah, a lot of people I think who give lip service to moral relativism would quickly abandon it as soon as they're given one good example.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, so yeah, and this is probably a different question, but so why is Christianity the grounding for that?
Well, I don't think Christianity is grounding for that. I think you just use God's existence.
Okay.
And the
Yeah.
way I would use argue for that foundation rally, even though I think that that third version of the argument I think is kind of the weakest of it. But I think it's just nice because it ties everything together. And its real strength is okay. Notice how a non-natural component of reality that has these supremely authoritative obligations for us, and we all ought to dictates, is not at all surprising given theism, but it's very surprising on atheism. I mean, given no experience of the world at all, would you really expect there to be a non-natural component of reality that has these supremely authoritative obligations that we all obey dictates? It's very surprising on atheism, not at all surprising on theism. And that fact, if it's true, provides evidence for theism.
I like it. I like it. Um. Yeah. That's awesome. Um. Yeah. I guess we can go ahead and move on. So I want to skip the next question and come back to it because I just had a this question here that relates. I don't know why I ordered it that way. Is there maybe it's philosophical, maybe not, but what do you think motivates atheists to live morally if they claim to not believe? And maybe that's evidence in itself. Maybe that's what we've already said, but what do you think
I sus-
motivates them to live morally?
Oh, I suspect it varies. One thing to keep in mind is that Romans chapter 2 thing I kind of alluded to earlier about talks about the law written on the heart.
Mhm.
But there's also another thing to keep in mind is C.S. Lewis, what he wrote in chapter 5 of Miracles. A moment after they admitted that good and evil are illusions, you'll find them exhorting us to work for posterity, to educate, revolutionize, liquidate, live and die for the good of the human race. For they write with indignation like men proclaiming what is good in itself and denouncing what is evil in itself, and not at all like men recording what they personally like mild beer, but some prefer bitter. They know far better than they think they know. End quote. And I think even among atheists who claim not to believe in reality, for many of them, it seems they have at least some intuitive awareness from reality existing. Even if they don't believe it consciously, it's if they believe it on some subconscious level. I think that motivates many of them to act morally.
Yeah, yeah. I've even seen a lot of them at almost think it's immoral for you to argue your position. Like it's why are you trying to change people's beliefs? That seems like a belief that they hold a lot. So anyway, that's beside the point. But um, yeah. So the next question, I guess we can move away from that now, unless you had any other thoughts on that.
No, not at the moment.
Cool. If I was smarter, maybe I could add more to it. Um, yeah. So the next question: what, if anything, would cause you to disbelieve the gospel? Is there something that could be introduced, or is there too much at this point, or like how do you think about even that scary type of question?
Oh, yeah, I can imagine evidence that would make me disbelieve in the gospel. So, for example, if I were to find out this were all a computer simulation and away from it, learned that certain historical beliefs I thought were facts, like Jesus dying by Roman crucifixion, his disciples having experiences of Jesus after he died and so forth, were not actually historical facts, but just part of the simulation, well, I wouldn't believe in the gospel anymore in that situation.
Yeah, that's that's a pretty far out there example. So, I mean, not very likely, right? So, anyway,
Yeah,
um,
seems unlikely to me.
yeah, for sure. Oh, lost my train of thought there. Yeah, so we'll just move on to the next question. And I'm not sure if you're thinking what I'm thinking on this question, but are you concerned with like Platonic thought, uh, Platonic categories, like the effect of that on Christianity or the Christian worldview? To you, is there any like problem there, or some people are skeptical of categories that for instance, are from Plato or from Aristotle, or using those categories in order to like articulate the Christian view?
I
Does
don't
that
know
make
that
sense?
Aristotle was a Platonist. I know Plato was a Platonist, almost by, well, maybe not modern Platonism as we conceive of it today, but yeah, there have been Platonists out there. Some people have issues with it. I'm personally not that invested in it. It's like
Mhm.
I know some philosophers have and have argued against it. William Lane Craig being an example.
Okay. Yeah, and so anyway, yeah, from my understanding, like people have a problem with like characteristics of God, like immutability and impassibility and things like that. Uh, but to me, those things just are articulating what the Bible says, and like Paul did that too. He spoke to Greeks. He used Greek language. He like wasn't afraid of, I guess, approaching those using their language or using their ideas to communicate a Christian idea. So I've heard some people defend it in that way, but anyway, yeah. So I was just curious if you had any thoughts on that, but yeah. Um, where are we at? Um, yeah, the next question. How can us regular people grow in our ability to debate atheists and or other religions?
Well, mainly if you're really serious interested about it, it's studying. Um, Not just studying one's own side of the issue, but the other side. So John Stuart Mill famously said, "He who knows only his side of the issue knows little of that." So yeah, studying. And if you like actually want to debate, practice too, studying practice, which is of course how you get through many things in life, how to be good at anything, studying practice.
Mhm. Um, yeah. Where do you live? What state are you in?
The great state of Minnesota.
Oh, nice. Are we
Yeah, you
we're on the
betcha.
same time zone, right?
Yes, and it's a
Okay.
good thing too. Otherwise, we wouldn't have showed up
Yeah.
on time.
Yep. Should have made sure of that beforehand. What kind of church do you attend? I'm just curious.
Oh, I go to a small Lutheran church.
All right. Got a Lutheran right behind me here. Francis Pieper.
All right.
That's cool. Was that your first type of church that you attended, or
I don't know. I was confirmed in the Lutheran faith. I assume that because I went through a number of churches over the years, even as a kid. I don't remember the first church I literally attended as a very small child.
cool?
Might have been a Lutheran church though.
All right. Yeah, I'm a big fan of the Lutherans. I'm not Lutheran myself, but I just have enjoyed reading from that tradition. Kind of being more firm in Protestantism and enjoying the history behind that, and finding my place in the Christian landscape. So,
I'm
yeah,
a
I mean
big
that's
fan
all
of the Catholics because they have the best horror movies.
they have the best horror movies.
Yeah.
The Passion,
Well, it's like Passion of the Christ. Well, I wouldn't necessarily consider. No, I mean like The Exorcist.
really? Oh,
Like
okay,
whenever have
yeah,
like investigating evil supernatural phenomena, it's always the Catholic dude. It's never Lutheran dude. It's like man, those Catholics got the best horror stuff.
yeah. Interesting. Exorcism. Um, man. So I know you said you're not like super deep into theology. You're more on the philosophical end of things.
My
Um,
degree's in philosophy, not theology.
yeah, yeah, and that's totally fine. Like, I mean, I have just all kinds of people on here, just random, all over the spectrum. But yeah. Did you want to say any more? Like, and I don't want to keep you too long. Are you in a hurry?
Um, Not super big hurry, and yet also sort of because I still got grad school homework to do. But
Okay,
I can stay a while
okay,
longer.
totally fine, totally fine. I'm glad to have you on here. Can I ask you just one more question? I was curious if you could. So you grew up in a Christian home, right?
Mhm.
So you kind of grew up being a Christian, had a little bit of doubt,
Yeah,
and
had
kind
some
of
doubts in high
grew in
school.
your evidence and arguments and things like that. That's cool. I was just curious. I didn't hear you say a lot about that on your other videos because it's pretty much just here's the logic, here's the evidence, here's the arguments, which is great. I mean, it's enjoyable. But I was just kind of curious on that. It's cool that you're kind of from a Lutheran tradition. I think that's a really strong tradition. Uh, but yeah, that's all I have. If you have any other thoughts or encouragement for people just trying to learn and trying to be evangelists and anything like that, I mean, feel free to share that. But if not, that's fine.
Well, when I publish my books, everybody should buy all of them because I like
Retweet.
money.
Yes, I'm excited. I'm excited. I haven't read any. I haven't really read any of your articles. I've just mostly watched videos because I'm trying. I'm dipping my toe in. I'm not quite hardcore into the philosophy yet, so I'm working on it. But yeah, I really appreciate you coming on. If you don't mind, just staying on for a few seconds, but I'm gonna go ahead and close this out. Yeah, guys, that's Wade Tisthammer. Check out his YouTube channel, Maverick Christian. It's really awesome. It'll blow your mind. Go watch him patiently debate atheists. It's really fun. But yeah, thanks for coming on, Wade. Really appreciate it.
Welcome.